We mixed up another 60 grams of resin. This time it's clear, so now we're going to finish laminating. You really want to wet out so that the chopped strand mat does not lift. You want it to have a really good bond with the layer beneath it. And the chopped strand mat really soaks up the resin. Again, you do not want dry plies. You want to make sure this is really wetted out. But you don't want it soppingly wet, but you do want it really dry. And no dry spots or dry marks. You want the resin or the glass to be almost translucent. You don't want any whitish strands, because that indicates that the fabric isn't wetted out enough. You notice between the two chopped strand mats, it's really soaking up the resin. We almost put another 60 grams of resin just in the two layers of chopped strand mat. You notice that the chopped strand isn't lifting anymore because we're starting to get a really nice saturated coat of resin on all of the plies. And we're going to mix up some more resin. You noticed I'm changing brushes each time. That way I want to keep the brush really clean for the final two coats. That way we don't have any pigment in the resin system. I'm going to go ahead and mix some more resin now. We've mixed another batch of 60 grams of resin. Let's put the final fiberglass ply on top of this lamination. You notice the final ply of fine woven fiberglass is covering up the really coarse chopped strand mat underneath, and that's the whole point of putting the fine woven on top of this chopped strand. You don't want any bleed through of that coarseness into the carbon. We now want to take the layer of carbon and we want to put it down, and we want to make sure our weave is flat and not crooked, because that will affect the cosmetic look of the weave when we put the clear coat on top. You want a nice straight weave. Hey everyone, for whatever reason I forgot to film this one section. So just imagine here, we're simulating, imagine we have the 5 plies of laminated glass and the 1 ply of carbon, and we've just finished applying the resin. Before we do the next step of putting the aluminum plate on top of the laminate, again, I forgot to film this, so what you want to do is when everything is laminated and you're completely done putting the carbon layer on top and putting the resin on top of that, what you want to do is take a piece of plastic, your drop cloth. You want to cover the laminate and smooth out the plastic. Okay, and then in the next step of the video, we'll be putting the aluminum sheet on top of the freshly laminated carbon and fiberglass. So go ahead and just substitute that. The video will continue now from where it left off, and hopefully you won't get too terribly confused with this step. And we're going to put another brick down. So now we're going to let this set. We're going to do something slightly different. Since we put the plastic over the layup and put the aluminum sheet and bricks on top, we're going to let it fully cure. Then we're going to let it sit overnight. Then we're going to uncover it, and then we're going to cut out the license plate shape. After it is cured, we're going to sand it with some sandpaper, and then once it's cut in the form of the license plate, then we're going to come on and put a couple of coats of clear on top. That way we'll save some resin, and we can cut everything else. We can cut the license plate out and then put the final coat of resin on top, which will give us a nice smooth finish without having to cut everything after it's been clear coated. It's the next morning now. Let's go ahead and remove the bricks, the aluminum plate, and let's uncover the composite. So as you can see, using the plastic sheet, the epoxy does not stick, so it's very easy to demold. Notice the thickness. By using the 6 plies, we have a fairly thin license plate frame, and also you can tell it's fairly rigid. So we're going to get the strength we need for the license plate frame. Let's go ahead and now go out and we'll trim down the composite to the license plate frame, and then we can start sanding and prepping. We have a paint marker here. We're going to go ahead and trace the outline of the license plate. And then we'll let this paint set up. One thing is, when you're cutting and drilling with carbon, the dust is very toxic. Make sure you wear a respirator. If you're going to use a Dremel tool, make sure you use the flexible shaft and keep the Dremel itself away from the dust area. I have carbon fiber dust is electrically conductive, and I've shorted out several Dremel tools, so make sure you use a flexible shaft. Keep that Dremel protected, covered with a cloth or something to keep the dust from getting into the brushed area of the electric motor. So let's go ahead now and we'll use a jigsaw to trim out. We're going to first drill some holes in the corner and cut out the center section. Now what you can do, save the center section. You can go ahead and cut some different small shapes and make keychains out of the center section. That way you won't waste all the carbon. And then you can use the license plate frame for the license plate frame, and then use the center section to make little, again, knickknacks or keychains for your vehicles. When you're working with the carbon, make sure you go outside when you're cutting and drilling. Again, it's very toxic. We're going to use a 1/2-inch drill bit to get into the corners. That way we can have enough room to place a jigsaw blade down inside the hole. So we're going to drill in each corner. That way we can gently cut out the center section with the jigsaw. Now we're going to get our jigsaw and we're going to trim out the inside first and then the outside. And we're going to give ourselves just a little extra clearance for sanding purposes. We want to make sure our edges are nice and smooth and straight. Now we're going to use the jigsaw to cut out the inside. Carbon is very brittle, so make sure you hold this plate down very strong. If the jigsaw grabs it and vibrates it, it could crack it. Okay, we have it rough cut it out. What I'm going to do is off camera, I'm going to trim it down closer to size, and then we'll come back with the drum sander and we'll clean up the edges. We're over at the belt sander now, and we're going to clean up the outside edges of the license plate frame. I've left a little bit extra on the edges to make it just a bit thicker, or a little bit wider on the edges. It'd give it just a little bit more strength. We'll come in with the drum sander and smooth up these edges here, and then we can come along and drill the holes. Then we're going to sand the whole plate before we get into laminating on the top for the really fine finished clear coat. What you want to do is when you're sanding the surface, you don't want to sand too deep. You don't want to sand into the weave of the carbon. What you want to do is just lightly abrade the surface so there will be enough grip for the epoxy to stick to the surface of the carbon. Once we're done sanding, we want to wash this off with water and wipe everything down with acetone before we continue on with the clear coat. Now we want to mark the holes for the license plate. Then we can drill those holes. We can make sure we sand around the holes, and then we'll clean up and we're ready for the clear coats. Now we can take a countersink and we can clean out the holes. If you don't have a countersink, you can use a rat tail file. Okay, now let's clean up the license plate holder. We'll wash it off first with water and then wipe it down with acetone, and then we can get on with the clear coating. I've taken the license plate frame, I've washed it off with water and dried it, and now you can take some either acetone or isopropyl alcohol, doesn't matter. I usually use acetone because I have it lying around, and we're going to wipe it really well. And then we'll go from there. Notice we are cleaning some carbon dust off of the license plate holder. Now, one of the reasons we're using the resin system that we are is this resin is a general purpose resin. It's not only good for laminating, but it's also good for casting or surface resin like tabletop resin. This resin has a UV additive to it, which is really good. Carbon, after a while sitting in the sun, will start to chalk out and get really crusty. So one of the reasons why we use this resin is for the UV additive. The other reason is once you put this resin on the license plate, it's going to self-level, so it's going to become very smooth. And then when we put the first coat down, we're going to hit it with the heat gun to burst any bubbles. You don't want any bubbles on the surface. So let's go ahead and mix up some resin and apply the first coat of resin to the license plate. We've mixed up 20 grams of resin, 10 grams of part A, 10 grams of part B. Now we're going to apply the first coat of the resin to the license plate frame. Just gently brush the resin onto the license plate frame. If you get any brush hairs, remove them. This first coat of resin is going to fill in any imperfections in the surface of the license plate. And there will be some, but that's okay. If you have your centerpiece that you want to do some keychains with, now's the time also to brush those as well. Now we're going to be building up several coats. So over the multiple coats, you're going to start seeing that beautiful three-dimensional depth in the carbon. You may see some little pinholes starting to form, and that's okay. What you want to do is take your brush and brush over those pinholes and try to fill them in. Once you get your first coat of resin on, get your heat gun and go over. Try to pop those bubbles. If you can't pop the bubbles, get yourself a little resin. And spread it around. As you see, you will get some bubbles. The resin, being self-leveling, will level out to be smooth. If you see any more bubbles, touch them up with some resin. And now we're going to let this sit. It could take up to 5 hours for this stuff, the resin, to become tacky. And you want to wait till it becomes tacky to where you can touch it without it disturbing the resin or getting on your finger. So we'll let this set for 5 hours. We'll come on and put a second coat on. We'll see how it's looking. You may need another coat, but once it's completely leveled with either 2 or 3 coats with no air bubbles, then we can lightly sand it and put some UV clear coat on top of that. So let's go ahead and let this set and tack up, and we'll come and put another coat on. It's been just over 5 hours. The resin is just slightly tacky to touch, doesn't leave an imprint on your finger. So we're ready to do the second coat. We've mixed up another 20 grams of resin, And the nice thing is the second coat should fill in any imperfections that were left in the first coat. If after you do the second coat there's still a little imperfections, the nice thing is you can just sand those imperfections out, sand the whole surface very lightly just to abrade the surface, and then you can put another coat on. So we're going to put the second coat on now. Then we want to take the heat gun and try to flow out and smooth the surface of the second coat. You notice the little imperfections on the second coat are smoothing out much nicer than on the first coat because we're building up the epoxy surface. If you can see, the surface is looking very smooth and very glossy now. So we're going to go ahead and let this cure overnight, and then in the morning we'll take a look and see how it's come out. Again, the nice thing is if there's any imperfections, we can always do a little sanding and put a third coat on. But I think the way it's looking right now, it's going to look really good after 2 coats. This is the next morning after the second clear coat. This doesn't look too bad. There is just one tiny little set of bumps right there. But I like it the way it is. Now there's a couple different routes you can take at this point. If you have some imperfections on your license plate holder, you can lightly sand it down and put another coat of resin on if you want. If the imperfections are very minor, what you can do is you can take some 400 grit sandpaper, lightly sand out the imperfections, and then you can use a gloss clear coat, and this has a UV additive in it as well. And then you can put a couple coats of clear on top, let it cure, and then you're ready to go. So there's several different approaches you can take here. I only have a very minor imperfection in this, and it's very, very glossy and very few imperfections. So I'm just going to leave mine the way it is. What you want to do is get yourself an X-Acto knife, and if you turn it around, you'll see some residual resin left over. We can then take that and very gently trim off the resin that's hanging over. If you do want to sand, very gently sand on the edges without getting any sand marks on the finish. If you happen to get a little sand marks on the finish, then just go ahead and 400 grit sand it and put your clear coat on top. Again, because the resin has UV additive in it, You don't necessarily need to put any clear coat on top of it. Again, it just depends how your particular license plate holder comes out. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to let it cure the rest of the day, get it hard as I can, and then I'll go ahead and mount it on the vehicle. So hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments section on the video. In the description section, I'm going to list with Amazon links all of the ingredients that I used in making this license plate. So if you want to duplicate this yourself, you'll have all the ingredients to make your own license plate holder. So thank you. We'll see you next video.